Well, tonight we're on chapter 10, and we're on the very last verse. So we'll make it into chapter 11 tonight. Verse 22 says, "Thy fathers went down into Egypt with 70 persons." So you remember when Joseph brought his father and his brothers and their families down there? That's how many people went into Egypt. And it's interesting if you study about why they went into Egypt. It was because they had failed to keep God's law, why they went into Egypt. Now, of course, God takes bad things and turns them into something good, and that's what He did for them. But it was not necessary. Had they been fully obedient to God's law, He would have protected them outside of Egypt, and they never would have had all that slavery and all those things that happened. I've wondered if that isn't an application for the last days, that maybe we wouldn't need to go through all the persecution that is predicted if we had been fully obedient. I don't know. I can't say for sure. But there's at least a possible parallel here. Then it says, "And now the Lord thy God hath made thee as the stars of heaven for multitude." You remember God took Abraham out, showed him the sky, and He said, "I'm going to make your descendants like the stars of heaven." Now we have a tendency to, through modern telescopes, to be aware of how many stars are up there, but they weren't aware of that. And so I forget, someone told me one time how many stars are visible with the naked eye, but it can't be much over 2 million, because when the children of Israel came out of Egypt, there was about 2 million if you count all the children and all the mothers and fathers and single people and everything. And so Moses says, God's promise to Abraham, it's been fulfilled. You went into Egypt with 70 people, you came out with 2 million people. And also in Deuteronomy 1, it mentions this and has an additional thought. Verses 10 and 11. It's in your book. It's page 76 if you have your syllabus. "The Lord your God hath multiplied you, and behold, ye are this day as the stars of heaven for multitude." So as Moses stands before the Israelites during that last month before they cross the Jordan River, he says God's promise has been fulfilled. But then verse 11 has an interesting thought. "The Lord God of your fathers make you 1,000 times so many more as ye are, and bless you as He hath promised you." Now if you take 2 million and put 1,000 times 2 million, what have you got? 1,000 times. Yeah. And today we have, I guess it's about, 8 billion? Somewhere around there, 7 or 8. So it would, even in today's world, it would be 1/4 of the population of the world. That's what God had in mind. But did they ever get close? No. They never got even close to those kind of things. But God had a plan. And the best I understand His plan was that step by step, as Israel grew, and they would grow in 2 ways. They would grow by having children, of course, and they would grow by nations having people leave the other nations and join them, because they saw how beneficial it was to be in their land. And nations would continue to get wiped out if they were belligerent. The signal for a nation to get wiped out was for them to want to attack Israel. And when they attacked Israel, that was their doom. And so there would be many nations eliminated, and there would be many people like Rahab and others that joined the Israelites, and they would keep expanding. And God said, you'll be 2 billion people under the true God of heaven. Wow. Well, now we shift over to, good to see you. We shift over to chapter 11. Now, before we look at 11, there's a comment that I found in Fundamentals, page 508. It says the 8th and the 11th chapters of Deuteronomy also mean much to us. The lessons that they contain are of the greatest importance and are given to us as verily as to the Israelites. Now, whenever one prophet stresses the importance of another prophet's material, it increases its value, I believe. Everything's valuable, but it increases it. We also read a statement that chapters 4 through 8 are very, very important for those that live in the last days of Earth's history. But now it takes in verse 11 in that very important category. So, verse 1, chapter 11 of Deuteronomy. Therefore, thou shalt love the Lord thy God, and keep his charge, and his statutes, and his judgments, and his commandments always. Now here is the foundation of success for any group of people that are called to be God's people. They have to consider the importance of obedience. And to sum up this verse, we could say obedience to everything he said. You know, I've been reading the fifth testimonies, and there's some really specific things. And the last one I was reading is how a manager should be. And it's talking about a manager of a publishing house, but there are principles about how to manage everything. And the question is, how many managers are following that? And as I read that chapter, I looked back on my own leadership and I said, well, I'm afraid I didn't follow everything. The one that especially stepped on my toes is, it said the manager should not take on more things than he can properly handle. Oh, I failed in that, yes.
I've got a question, sir. When I read that verse, and it says, and keep his statutes, and his judgments, and his commandments. I've got a confession. I've always honed in on the commandments, but the statutes and the judgments, I have always applied those as being nailed to the cross. Am I wrong? And if I am, could you expound on that so that I won't be wrong?
Okay.
I won't be wrong.
There is several types of laws. This one has several in it, but other texts have different words and so on. So I'll just boil it down to what it appears to me God is saying. We have what we generally call the ceremonial law. The ceremonial law describes how, the sanctuary operated and how they were to worship God and the sacrifice of animals and the feast days and that whole system that they had. Ceremonial laws. Those, the New Testament clearly identifies, were nailed to the cross. They no longer needed to be kept because they all pointed to Jesus And once Jesus came, we look at him, not at those practices. Now, it's still okay to study it because you learn a lot about Jesus when you study it, but not to practice it. However, there are other types of laws. The Ten Commandments are at the bottom. In a sense, everything else is built on the Ten Commandments. But then we have, in this case, it mentions 2 statutes. That is more specific descriptions about keeping the commandments. For instance, I'll give you 2 of them that'll come later in Deuteronomy. In those days, they built a lot of flat rooftops. Now, there's a danger when you have a flat roof that if somebody's up there, they could fall off. So a statute said you have to build a railing around your roof so nobody can fall off. Why? Because if they fall off, you may be guilty of killing them. See, it's based on the commandment, thou shalt not kill. Another one is that they were warned, don't move your neighbor's landmark. Well, it's obvious, if you moved his landmark, and you took part of his land, you're stealing his land. So there were a lot of those, and there's quite a few in Deuteronomy. Don't cut yourself in a certain way, don't shave your beard in a certain way. Various things, all kinds of statutes. Those were not nailed to the cross. They are just as valid today as they ever were. And we need to pay attention to those. And through the spirit of prophecy, we have a lot more. A lot more statutes that we should be practicing. Then we have judgments. Now, the judgments were especially for the judges, so that God revealed, if they do this, this is the penalty that they are to receive. And one of those is if somebody in anger or whatever destroys an eye of their neighbor and they are brought into court, the court has hopefully read the Bible and they say, well, the penalty for this is we have to take your eye. And, of course, those seem awfully harsh to us in today's world, but it gets sin stopped. God doesn't just pet sin. He has a plan to stop it. If you knew that was going to happen to you, you'd be more careful what you did to your neighbor. And so those are the main areas of laws. And the only one that was nailed to the cross was the ceremonial law. Now there are a few in Deuteronomy that I've wondered, is that supposed to still be followed today? But I don't feel comfortable to say no, it doesn't need to be followed today. Because the vast majority, it's fairly easy to see, yes, that should be followed today, just like it was back then. Going on to verse 2. Yes.
Would there be any evaluation or differentiation for items that were in the area of judgments based on the fact that the Israelites were in a theocracy back then, and therefore God was directing those judges more directly through the prophets and so forth, and we don't live under that kind of theocracy anymore.
Well, that's a good point. The judgments, for instance, I don't know that we would want to teach that a judge today should implement those things. We can say it would be better if we were under that program, but another change happened, I believe, when we moved into the Christian era. Besides the ceremonial law being nailed to the cross. And that is that he separated the responsibility. The church is responsible for the first 4 commandments, and the state is responsible for the last 6 commandments. And so they set up their penalties. They sometimes follow the Bible to some degree. It's interesting how much of the Bible they do follow in that, but they wouldn't follow it entirely, and they wouldn't have the Urim and Thummim to be able to go to God when there was a question and say, now, how should we handle this case? Of course they could pray, but still it's not the same as the Urim and Thummim. So yeah, I guess that would also be a change. And know ye this day, for I speak not with your children which have not known. So he said, I'm addressing you parents right now, because your children have not been aware of some of the things of the past, and which have not seen the chastisement of the Lord your God, his greatness, his mighty hand, and his stretched out arm. So number 3, where it says chastisement, trying to see what the margin says on that. Discipline, yeah. So the word chastisement means discipline. So he's pointing them to the fact that God disciplined them, and he also revealed how great he was, and it pictures his power to lead them out as his stretched out arm was able to lead them out. And verse 3, and his miracles and his acts, which he did in the midst of Egypt, unto Pharaoh the king of Egypt, and unto all his land. Now, as we look at this reminder of the wonderful miracles that were worked, we see what's going to happen in the very last days. Because as Jesus is leading us to the heavenly Canaan, we have to be delivered. And of course, many people will be delivered before the close of probation, but in a very special sense, after the close of probation, every one of God's people will be delivered from a lot of things that the enemy wants to do to them. And so we are going to be prepared for that by realizing the stories of what God did for the Israelites and how He delivered them. In Third Spiritual Gifts, page 204, the Lord told Moses that the signs and wonders which he should show before Pharaoh would harden his heart, because he would not receive them, and God would multiply his signs. Same thing's going to happen in the end. You know, the uniting of the 3 great influences, the papacy, the apostate Protestantism, and the spiritualism, as they unite together, they are going to have things happen that harden their hearts. Jesus is going to appear. What looks like Jesus is going to appear, but it'll really be Satan. Other things will happen, and it will confirm in their mind that they're on the right track. And yet, when it comes to a head like it did with Pharaoh, they're going to find out they're on the wrong side, because they've hardened their heart over and over again. And there will be miracles of God's people too, that these men will witness. They will see how God delivered them. and what he did for them. Miracles probably like, Paul, Saul before he became Paul. He saw Stephen looking into heaven, and it just made an indelible impression on his mind. Those kind of things will happen. There will be no excuse for the hardening of the heart, but they will turn it all off, and their heart will be fully hardened. Every punishment which the king rejected would bring the next chastisement more close and severe, until the proud heart of the king would be humbled, and he should acknowledge the maker of the heavens and the earth as the living and all-powerful God. He persisted until his son was dead. And finally, he had a window of sorrow. And during that window, Israel got out. But then, even that one, he hardened his heart against that one too. So, that's the way it is when people reject light. All of us need to be careful not to reject the light, to cherish every bit. We may have to pray and say, Lord, this is a hard saying, but please help me. Help me to follow what this says. Okay, going on, verse 4. Chapter 11, by the way. And what he did unto the army of Egypt. What an incredible story that is, to have a whole army swallowed up in the water. And, I wondered, how in the world could the king be so foolish as to march into that opening through the water? But as I researched all I could find from the inspired writings on this, it was kind of dark, and he didn't know that he was in that channel. All he knew, he was following the Israelites. And he heard the noise up ahead of him, and so he knew they were going in there. And so he figured he could go after them. And it wasn't until later that when the darkness cleared and the fog and everything, he realized where he was, in the middle. Yes.
I sometimes think, first of all, I'm convinced that sin is insane.
Mm-hmm.
And I think when you're in the midst of an insanity spree, in the midst of sin, you'll do things that, looking back in retrospect, just didn't make any sense at all. Because it didn't make any sense. So I'm a little bit uncomfortable with the idea he didn't know. I think he was in such a rage that everything else is irrelevant. Go get him. and history shows after that you hear no more about it. I mean, Egypt ruled the world.
Yeah.
Into that event.
Yeah. Yes.
When you think of the story of the donkey speaking to Balaam, if the donkey speaking to you, won't you say, what? Won't you be surprised? When you talk back to the donkeys, you're so much in sin. And sin has taken us over so much that we cannot even see to make the change when we have to.
Yeah.
And that's what's happened. Pharaoh couldn't see because my brother said he was in such a passion to get these people. Imagine a sea parted and you're going to run through the sea because you're so much passion. It's like insanity.
Yeah.
But that's what it is. Talking to the donkey is insanity because the donkey can't talk.
Yeah.
And Eve spoke to the serpent. Serpent can't speak. Sin. That's what it is. Yes. The nature of it.
Yes. Well, I think that's certainly true too. But you remember the cloud went between Pharaoh and the Israelites. On Pharaoh's side it was darkness, but on the side of Israel was light. And so God had the Israelites marching in the light, but Pharaoh was marching in the darkness. And he was following the noise up ahead of him. And I think he was motivated by tremendous anger as well. In other words, if he hadn't been so angry, he would have said, we better wait till the light comes because I don't know really what's going on. All right, going on, it says, backing up, and what he did unto the army of Egypt, unto their horses, and to their chariots, how he made the water of the Red Sea to overflow them as they pursued after you, and how the Lord hath destroyed them unto this day. Now, I don't know if you ever heard Ron Wyatt speak about this crossing of the Red Sea, but I tend to lean toward his version being correct. There's different versions. Some people even think there was only a few inches of water and they had to cross there, which is ridiculous. But the actual place where they crossed has been a matter of, difference of opinion. But Ron Wyatt found a spot where right through the middle of the Red Sea, it's like a shelf has been built there. And so over here the water is very deep and it rises up and there's a shelf there. And when he discovered that, he found these old wagon wheels and things, along the path. And so it convinced him that he had found the right spot. Now, archaeologists don't credit him because he doesn't have a PhD in archaeology or any of those kind of things. But he was an Adventist. He passed away. He was an Adventist that really believed the inspired writings, all of them. And so he would read in the Bible what it said. He would read in Ellen White's writings what it said. And then he would look for what he read about. And I think he found the Ark, Noah's Ark. I don't know about the Ark of the Testament. He thought he found that, but he never could even get a picture of it or any tangible evidence. And when I've read the quotations about it, I don't think it makes it crystal clear that it will be found. It might be, but you can't absolutely say it will be found. And he got shut out. He couldn't go back anymore, and so he died without making that discovery. But on the Ark and on the crossing of the Red Sea, the evidence he produced made sense to me, and I believe that God must have built that shelf. God sees the future or better than we see the past. And so he built the Red Sea, knowing that at some point the Israelites would have to cross over there, but it was deep enough that you would drown. It wasn't brought real high, but it was high enough. Otherwise, you couldn't even cross the Red Sea.
But this is why all of the armies of the Egyptians died. This is deep enough to drown everybody.
That's right.
Shallow. Ain't nobody can drown. You just run back on the other side.
Yeah.
See, I don't argue the Bible with people. But I've spoken on this subject before with people, and when they try to tell me the Red Sea was a few inches deep, I jump and shout back much more. You mean to tell me my God wiped out a whole army with 2 or 3 inches of water?
Yeah, that's true. It's kind of a ridiculous thought. Verse 5 says, and what he did unto you in the wilderness, until you came into this place. Now he's transitioning to this period of time, basically 40 years now, lacking a month. 40 years, and he brings up one of the bad things that happened. There was a whole series of terrible things that happened, and thousands of people died. But he brings up one in verse 6. And what he did unto Dathan and Abiram, the sons of Eliab, the son of Reuben, how the earth opened her mouth and swallowed them up, and their households, and their tents, and all the substance that was in their possession in the midst of all Israel.
Everybody fled in all directions.
Yeah, everybody fled, and later they said, Moses, you've killed these people. Isn't that amazing? How can Moses make the ground open up and all these people disappear into the ground? Now, there's a reason, I believe, why this particular story is brought to our attention. Because it happens again and again, but probably there's going to be a really big one. And I'm wondering if we aren't on the verge of this right now. I heard some things about some pastors who are extremely angry that they would get disciplined for not following what the GC voted almost 5 years ago. And then in a later meeting, there was a decision to discipline these individuals. If they do not succeed in getting rid of Ted Wilson, which I pray they won't, in the next GC, we might see that erupt. We might see that take place. I don't know. But it could happen anyway. So it's something to watch. As you study this rebellion of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram, and we won't go into, all those details here, but these men were convinced that they could run things better. They were convinced that Moses was too busy telling the people what was wrong with them and constantly trying to straighten them out. But if he would encourage them and tell them what good people they were, that, better progress would be made. And they actually convinced themselves that if they could take over the leadership of Israel, that they would get to the promised land a lot faster and a lot better. And an awful lot of people were thinking that they were right. And, they had quite a following. And so this is a warning for the end, yes.
I don't remember where it is, but I've read a statement that's very clear that says true rebellion is almost incurable.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah. Once a person gets into that attitude of absolute rebellion, and they're absolutely convinced that they're right, and they get a bunch of other people behind them, it is a miracle if they ever change. I mean, it would really be unusual for them to change. All right, let's look at a little bit of the story back in Numbers 16, verses 23 to 32, but I will do some skipping to kind of shorten the story. The Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the congregation, saying, Get you up from about the tabernacle of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. So he warned the people, you better get away from these three men's tents. And Moses rose up and went unto Dathan and Abiram. And the elders of Israel followed him. And Moses said, Hereby ye shall know that the Lord has sent me to do all these works. for I have not done them of mine own mind. If these men die the common death of all men, or if they be visited after the visitation of all men, then the Lord hath not sent me. So God directed him to set up a test. He says, if they die a natural death, then I'm in the wrong. But if the Lord make a new thing, and the earth open her mouth and swallow them up with all that appertain unto them, and they go down quick into the pit, then ye shall understand that these men have provoked the Lord. And it came to pass, as he had made an end of speaking all these words, that the ground clave asunder that was under them, and the earth opened her mouth and swallowed them up, and their houses, and all the men that appertained unto Korah, and all their goods. So it was a testimony that Moses was the true leader, and he was correct in the message he had given. Now notice a little bit about Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. 3 Testimonies 3:44. Korah, Dathan, and Abiram first commenced their cruel work upon the men to whom God had entrusted sacred responsibilities. They were successful in alienating 250 princes who were famous in the congregation, men of renown.
That's third of the angels.
Yeah. And so Satan worked through these men to repeat what happened in heaven. And leadership that falls for this is really very unwise leadership. And so it's a warning to leaders. You better be careful when somebody goes around griping and complaining about what's going on. You better check it out to be sure before you get on board. But those 250 princes, they didn't do that. And they began to think, well, Korah, Dathan, and Abiram have a good platform. We're going to get behind them. With these strong and influential men on their side, they felt sure of making a radical change in the order of things. They thought they could transform the government of Israel and greatly improve it from its present administration. Now, I heard a comment from some of the group that don't like Ted Wilson right after he first got elected. And their statement was, now getting him as the president puts us 30 years behind where we were. They felt they were moving towards certain objectives in the church and they wanted to achieve them, but now they could see we're not going to succeed under him. And so they were extremely disappointed. Many of the ones that had already left tried to get a bunch more to leave and join them. And I suppose some did. I had no idea how many, left out of that. But in a way, that's a blessing. If they're not going to follow the right path, they might as well leave. But quite a few stayed in, and, we'll see what happens. I hope God straightens it all out and nothing happens. But I see a danger, and I believe this story is a prediction.
God is in control.
Absolutely. God is in.
We don't need to worry.
No.
That's not our job.
We don't need to worry. That's absolutely true. In Patriarchs and Prophets 3:97 and 8, it says, Korah reviewed the history of their travels through the wilderness, where they had been brought into straight places, and many had perished because of their murmuring and disobedience. Can you just see Satan putting his rose-colored glasses or something in front of their eyes, and they're looking at the same history, but they're coming up with a different conclusion.
Oh, this troublemaker.
Yeah. His hearers thought they saw clearly that their troubles might have been prevented if Moses had pursued a different course. They decided that all their disasters were chargeable to him and that their exclusion from Canaan was in consequence of the mismanagement. So their process of all that is Moses has made mistake after mistake. They didn't consider that Moses never did anything unless God told him to do it. And yet they felt that they saw great errors. The consequence of the mismanagement of Moses and Aaron, that if Korah would be their leader and would encourage them by dwelling upon their good deeds instead of reproving their sins, they would have a very peaceful, prosperous journey instead of wandering to and fro in the wilderness. They would proceed directly to the promised land. Now just think of all the statements that God made in the Bible that they ignored to come to that conclusion. God said you're going to wander 40 years in the wilderness. So they're on schedule. But Korah thinks that they should be able to get there faster. Also in 3 Testimonies 3:55, it says, "It is hardly possible for men to offer a greater insult to God than to despise and reject the instrumentalities that He has appointed to lead them." So, I suppose there is room for us to give advice to a leader, but not to go around criticizing that leader and trying to take his job because we think we could do better. It says it's hardly possible to have a greater insult than that. God is able to change leaders if a leader really isn't what they should be. He's able to do that. So we really should be warned if we get in that groove.
The one thing next to that is to reject Ellen White.
Well, that thought crossed my mind too, that I believe that is an example of the Korah, Dathan, and Abiram also. Yes.
I think this passage here, the statement, can relate to those red books that everybody's taken to Maccabees.
Yes.
So, all these things that God has stated, getting rid of them, I think this can apply to that.
Oh, yes. The slow but steady development of an attitude against part of Ellen White's writings, usually they don't attack all of them, because some of them are so obvious, like Desire of Ages and Great Controversy and some of these. But there is an attitude that for a long time has developed against the more specific things that have been revealed. And so I think this is also a fulfillment of the Korah, Dathan, and Abiram rebellion. And a lot of people are involved in it.
She warned us that there will be the one last sons.
That's true. That's true. Conflict and Courage, page 108. God tells us what was the problem in Korah, Dathan, and Abiram's heart. It was pride and ambition that prompted Lucifer to complain of the government of God and to seek the overthrow of the order which had been established in heaven. And Satan put that same pride and ambition into these men's hearts. Since his fall, it has been his object to infuse the same spirit of envy and discontent, the same ambition for position and honor, into the minds of men. He thus worked upon the minds of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram to arouse the desire for self-exaltation and excite envy, distrust, and rebellion. I call this the Savior syndrome. And there's so many that fall for this. Pastors, professors, people that deal with spiritual subjects. That it's so easy for them to get to the point where they feel that they see something that nobody else sees, and they've got to save the church by getting everybody to believe this idea. And sometimes it doesn't go very far, and other times thousands and thousands of people accept that idea. But yet it's not correct. And Satan plays upon that evil aspect of our nature to try to get us that way. Satan caused them to reject God as their leader by rejecting the men of God's appointment. So if we reject the one that God appoints or the ones that He appoints, then we're really rejecting God. We're saying you didn't make a good choice. You should have picked somebody else. And that is not a wise course. Yet while in their murmuring against Moses and Aaron, they blasphemed God. They were so deluded as to think themselves righteous and to regard those who had faithfully reproved their sins as actuated by Satan. Totally reversed. They thought they were of Satan when they were of God, but actually Korah, Dathan, and Abiram, and the 250 princes and all the rest that joined them, they were the ones of Satan. And they could have, from a careful review of what had been written, they could have seen their error. But they weren't doing that. And the last quote that we'll look at, Counsels on Diets and Foods, page 428. The facts relative to Korah and his company, who rebelled against Moses and Aaron and against Jehovah, are recorded for a warning to God's people, especially those who live upon the earth near the close of time. Now going back to our other connection, Moses was a prophet. Ellen White is a prophet. And so that one for sure. But then perhaps some other examples of this. Satan has led persons to imitate the example of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram in raising insurrection among the people of God. So many of these things. Some are small, maybe just in one church, maybe just in one area, one country, or something. But some of them can become very big. And, this argument that has led to discipline has been going on for many, many years. And so, finally, it was hoped that if it could be brought up one more time, that it would succeed. But it got voted down by a big vote. And so that has been very, very frustrating to many people. Well, that's a good place to stop.